Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast about foreign policy and world affairs. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg, editor of UN Dispatch. And in this show, we discuss topical global issues, have conversations with foreign affairs thought leaders and newsmakers, and give you the context you need to understand the world today. Go to globaldispatchespodcast.com to learn more. And now on with the show. On January 23rd, the 35-year-old head of Venezuela's National Assembly, Juan Guaido, declared himself president of Venezuela, promising he would serve in that role on an interim basis before free and fair elections could be held. He was quickly recognized as the legitimate head of state by the United States, Canada, the Organization of American States, and many countries in Latin America. Of course, the de facto president, Nicolas Maduro, is rejecting this claim. At time of recording, he still controls the government and, most importantly, the security services. Maduro is also backed by other countries in the region and key international players like Russia. There is now an extremely dangerous standoff underway in Venezuela, the outcome of which is far from certain. On the line to provide some context to help you understand this crisis is Ivan Briscoe. He is the regional director for Latin America with the International Crisis Group. We kick off discussing the political context of this situation, including how a relatively unknown politician came to declare himself president. We then discuss the crucial role of the military and security services in determining the political future of Venezuela, and whether or not it was a mistake for the United States and other countries to quickly rally behind Guaido. This is obviously a very rapidly unfolding situation, and I'm confident that this conversation will give you the context and background you need to interpret events as they unfold in the coming days and weeks. If you're new to the podcast, welcome. Please visit globaldispatchespodcast.com to peruse our robust archives of episodes about events, issues, and global trends that are critical for understanding the world but don't often get the exposure they deserve. That's most of what this show is all about. If you're a longtime listener, thank you. I've recently set up a rewards program in which you can get some freebies and other bonuses for simply telling friends and colleagues about the show. To learn more about the referral program and the rewards you can unlock by simply sharing the show, just click on the link on the homepage or in the description field of this episode in iTunes or wherever you are listening. All right, now here is my conversation with Ivan Briscoe of the International Crisis Group.
Well, Juan Guaido is from the Voluntad Popular party, which has been a prominent opposition party for the last few years. But he's a very junior politician within that party. He's only 35 years old. So why, the question is, has he assumed such prominence that he has declared himself with the opposition support to be interim president? I mean, the reason for this is that the leader of the party has been under arrest for the last 5 years, Leopoldo Lopez, and the two other senior figures within the party have been harassed politically, judicially, left the country, and are no longer able to assume such power. So on the 5th of January, as part of a general rotation of control between the different opposition parties that have a majority in the National Assembly, it was his turn, or his party's turn, to be the chair of the National Assembly. Now, why is that such an important detail? Well, his nomination as chair of the National Assembly came just 5 days, before Maduro was re-inaugurated, having supposedly won elections in May of last year. The point being here that those elections are contested, disputed. There are substantial evidence to suggest that there was rigging, unfairness, that it was not an equitable vote, that it was biased towards the government, and as a result of which there are grounds to believe that the election result was not fair and that Maduro was not a legitimate president in his second term. No one contests that his first term was not based on a legitimate vote, but the second term has fallen under the shadow of considerable doubt. And that is the basis for all the political drama we are now seeing. The assumption that Maduro's second term is not legitimate, and the rise of a new politician who has taken charge of the National Assembly at a moment in which, for many people, particularly for the opposition, that is now the only legitimate democratic institution in Venezuela.
So we are speaking on Thursday, January 24th. On Wednesday, the 23rd, Juan Guaido declared himself president. Can you just sort of discuss the events leading up to that rather dramatic moment that we saw yesterday?
Well, indeed. I mean, all of this makes little sense were it not for the general background, the state in which Venezuela finds itself, which is appalling. I mean, Venezuela is in a terrible economic crisis with extreme hyperinflation, scarcity of food, and emigration so far in the last few years of 3 million Venezuelans out of the country, which the UN expects will increase by another 2 million in the next year.
To put that in context, that's like maybe 10 to 15% of the population. This is a huge migration.
Well, if it reaches 5 million, we're talking about a sixth of the entire Venezuelan population, exactly. Which is a huge number, many of them going obviously to neighboring countries in Latin America. So we have this context of terrible economic demise, of a closing down of all democratic space by a government which has been in power now for 20 years. First through Hugo Chavez, then through Nicolas Maduro, and which has, over the last few years, basically closed down all democratic space and taken authoritarian control over the country. So the context of Venezuela is one of economic collapse, of a political closure of democratic space, of intensive hostilities between the opposition and the government, which are reflected on the international stage. So you see a great polarization between the supporters of the government of Maduro, Russia, China, Turkey, certain other countries in Latin America, Cuba, obviously, and those which are opposed to Maduro and maintain that now is the moment in which Maduro must leave power because he has not been democratically re-elected. So a substantial number of Latin American countries and the United States and Canada. That being the context, what we've seen since 10th of January is that extreme polarization and great tension in a context of great economic despair playing out on the streets and in the politics of Venezuela. So in the last few days, we've seen wildcat protests, mass assemblies of opponents of Venezuela, of the Maduro government, calling for radical change, calling for the usurper Maduro to be thrown out of power, and growing movement internationally in Latin America and North America for Maduro to leave. And if he is not to leave, and there's no sign at the moment that he is leaving, for him basically to be declared an illegitimate president with no entitlement to power. And that is the situation which, since the 23rd of January, we effectively find ourselves in.
So does Guaido have like a base of popular support? Does he have like a constituency, or what is his constituency? Because obviously he does have one, because there's this massive crowd that cheered on his sort of self-proclaimed inauguration as sort of interim president. So who makes up his constituency?
I mean, it remains, an extraordinary fact that a politician who was, until a few months ago, utterly unknown, has been able to crystallize such an extraordinary remobilization of an opposition movement which was effectively, until the end of last year, largely dormant. How has he been able to do that? Well, I think a part of it is the latent despair and angst and indignation of the Venezuelan people, which he has managed to capture. I mean, for the most part of last year, the opposition was in an appalling state, demoralized and divided. he seems to have re-energized it with a very clear call for a return to democracy and a return to constitutional rule, and with really strong support from across the Americas. And so that has sort of catalyzed a public reaction, which has been seen in these large gatherings of the last few weeks of the wildcat protests in areas of Caracas, which were formerly very close to Chavismo, which were low-income neighborhoods loyal to the cause over the last 2 decades. And he seems to have brought all these elements together, and therefore when he declared himself interim president on the 23rd of January, it was, has been applauded by many Venezuelans. But the bottom line is despite all this opposition, which is evident to Nicolas Maduro and to his government, it is not clear at all that the basic structures of power, of coercive power, military power and armed force in Venezuela, which sustain Maduro's government at the moment, are going to follow suit and move towards the start of the opposition and the interim president.
Well, so you seem to be suggesting that Maduro's base of support is being eroded, but does he still sustain or have any semblance of popular support? And if so, who makes up his base?
I mean, of course he does. There's no doubt. We're talking 20 to 25% of their Venezuelan electorate, which in poll after poll, and even in a context of hyperinflation and economic collapse, maintains that it supports the government of Nicolas Maduro. Well, why is that? Well, I think the critics, the skeptics, would say, well, they're being basically paid off by the government. They're receiving food rations, they're receiving free housing, they're receiving perks and jobs and privileges which keep them alive. I think that is a slightly too cynical point of view. You have to remember that Hugo Chavez, which is, of course, the precursor of Nicolas Maduro and the creator of Chavismo, was an incredibly charismatic and effective politician who won election after election until he died in 2013. And that polarization in Venezuela exists, and Chavismo maintains the loyalty of a part of the electorate who looks at the opposition and looks at the traditional elite of the country, if you like, as with great distrust, basically, and still does not trust the opposition to actually bring about fairness and equity and access to power for all in Venezuelan society, and that is the roots of the remaining loyalty that exists to Maduro, a combination of ideological and no doubt the interest, the material interest of certain people in continuing to have access to power and access to the possibilities of making money in what is an oil state, fundamentally.
So one consensus I'm seeing emerging among experts, and I would like to put this question to you, is that right now what's key is the role of the military and the security services. That, as we're speaking, they still retain loyalty to Maduro, but to the extent that they might abandon Maduro and back Guaido, that is when we'll know that this move, this daring political move by Juan Guaido is successful. Can you talk a bit about, one, if you agree with that assessment, and two, what role the security services are playing and can play and might be able to play to ensure that this does not descend into some really god awful places?
I mean, here this is precisely at the center of all attention now. If an opposition politician in an authoritarian regime declares himself, even with public support and the acclamation of all parties in the opposition and foreign countries, declares himself to be an interim president, but does not have control over the most important structures of coercive power in the country, the security forces, the armed forces, then it's a hollow gesture. fundamentally. It's the creation of a parallel government with no real ability to claim that it authority, real authority over the country. No capacity to deliver government programs, no capacity to police the streets, no capacity to do anything for the people. Nor to rule brutally or otherwise, and this is we're in the situation at the moment. We simply don't know. The assumption has to be that this decision to declare Guaido an interim president on the 23rd was based on the perception that there were to be parts of the military which would defect, which would abandon their loyalty to Nicolas Maduro and either go to the side of Guaido or become arbiters in a future negotiation and transition, potentially leading to elections. Thus far, we have not seen these defections happen. Indeed, just today, on the 24th, we have seen a series of declarations of loyalty by the armed forces, and it remains to be seen whether that will change or whether parts of the armed forces will change their mind. The problem here is that obviously if none of them do, we have in our hands a hollow gesture by the opposition with no substance behind it. We have the risk, the very strong risk, that there will be a violent crackdown against the opposition, potentially including the outright dissolution of the National Assembly in the coming days and weeks. And we have the third and perhaps most worrying possibility that in response to a crackdown by the government or the mistreatment of Juan Guaido, the calls for foreign military intervention, particularly from the US and from its Latin American allies who support Guaido, will intensify. And that's where it becomes very difficult to see exactly what will happen, what the effects will be in Venezuela.
Well, that kind of leads me into my next question, which is the role and the effect of the country, of the fact that some countries have lined up behind Guaido and some have lined up behind Maduro. What effect is that having on the ground?
Well, on the ground in Venezuela, I presume you mean it's purely a reflection of the division and polarization within Venezuelan society that has now assumed geopolitical tints. So what was formerly, to a degree, merely a Venezuelan internal political matter until, let's say, 3 or 4 years ago, has become part of a broader geopolitical divide with all its confusions and uncertainties and doubts as to whether the supreme multilateral institutions, the UN, for example, will actually be able to respond to any deepening of this crisis.
I would doubt it. It seems like it's going the way of Syria in terms of the great powers picking opposite sides, which paralyzes the Security Council.
You've got Russia and China and Turkey and Iran outside the region who have supported Maduro. You've got within the region Bolivia, Nicaragua, and Cuba that have supported the government. You have Mexico and Uruguay who have declared themselves neutral and disposed to support any negotiations. And then you have a host of other Latin American countries, obviously alongside the US and Canada, who have opposed to Maduro and have declared Guaido the interim president. And these include the neighboring countries of Venezuela, Colombia and Brazil, the two countries most affected by Venezuelan mass migration in the recent years. So in effect, you have a series of fronts which have been created. Now, at the same time, would Russia and China or those other allies actually step up to support Venezuela militarily in the case of a real escalation in hostilities? There are serious doubts as to that, just as there are doubts as to whether the United States and its Latin American allies would actually dare to intervene militarily in a context where the risk of an explosive escalation or perpetuation of low-intensity conflict are very high. Let's not forget that in Venezuela there are numerous state and non-state armed actors there is the highest murder rate in the world, and there is a huge prevalence of firearms. This is not a context in which an armed force, an external armed force, would wish to engage in an occupation over the long term. The other possibility, of course, would be a surgical strike, I suppose, aimed at certain parts of the sitting Venezuelan government, Maduro, the chiefs of the armed forces. But again, the risks of causing a broader conflagration in Venezuela and the region remain extremely high.
Do you think it was a mistake for the United States and the OAS and other countries to recognize Guaido as the president so quickly?
If that was a call based on the certainty that there was a substantial part of the government and the armed forces that would defect and would declare itself either neutral or opposed to Maduro, there is some reason to believe that that is a sensible move. If that was based on a hunch, a belief that facts on the ground could be created by a verbal declaration without any sustenance or a basis behind it in the reality in Venezuela, then it was premature and it was reckless.
What events or any contingencies will you be looking for in the coming days and weeks that will suggest to you how this situation might unfold in the broader trajectory of this crisis?
I think in the immediate term, as I said already, obviously we have to look at the movement of military loyalties, the first impressions we're having at the moment if they're staying aligned to Maduro. Second, we have to look at the agitation on the streets. Do these marches and protests, which you've seen in recent days, continue and get worse, or do they subside? Along with that, we also have the question of the level of government repression. This weekend, we will be coming to a particularly thorny issue, which is what happens to the U.S. Embassy. As you may know, as your listeners may know, in reaction to the U.S. recognition of Guaido, Maduro severed all ties with the U.S. And declared that the embassy staff there would have to leave within 72 hours. Obviously, the U.S. doesn't recognize Maduro's authority to make that call. So what will happen to the U.S. embassy staff? Will there be a siege? Will they leave anyway? And what is the possibility that this potential standoff, will actually lead to the issue being discussed at higher geopolitical level? Will there be talks in the UN? Will there be some form of informal negotiation between the US, Latin American countries, Russia and China? Is there any possibility of really getting negotiations going, building the confidence necessary for negotiations? Can these assorted international powers come together and recognize that the situation in Venezuela is dire, that there should be no supreme winner, that neither side can just assume total control and say the situation is resolved? There needs to be a compromise. There needs to be a space for negotiation. Is there any possibility of generating space for that? Or are we looking just at the route towards deeper polarization, hostilities, and more misery for the Venezuelan people?
Well, Ivan, we will have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time. This was clarifying.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed.
All right. Thank you all for listening. Big thank you to Ivan Briscoe for speaking with me on such short notice. I caught up with him while he was at a conference on Latin American security, as it turns out. He was in Belize, and he kindly stepped out of his conference to take the call on his cell phone, which is why the connection is a little fuzzier than my typical audio production. In any case, I am extremely glad that he took the time to speak with me. I found this really helpful. As I mentioned at the outset, if you are a regular listener to the show, do check out that referral program. Basically, all you have to do is share a special link of the show with your friends and colleagues, and you'll unlock rewards that I'll send you. Everyone wins. All right, we'll see you next time. Bye.